Lovies, it's David McGillivray here, horror icon, a comedy legend, and I'm here with another edition of Little Did You Know. It's a chat show in which I talk to people I find interesting, and I hope you agree. And at this point, I normally do this, and up comes a banner giving you a link to a Patreon. And if you click that link, you can find that for as little as £1, you can get all kinds of goodies. True, I wouldn't make it up. Now, this is a first today on the show. Before I started this chat show, I did another one. And this was for an outfit called Likey. And if you want to know more about Likey, you can go to the first episode of this series because that's where I talk about Likey in no uncertain terms, I might add. But this basically was what happened. Every day, for nearly a month, I went out and did a live chat with somebody I found interesting. And this was not recorded. And I thought that this was a bit of a shame. This was back in September when we could do such things. We could meet face to face. Now we're just virtual. But I thought, some of these people are so entertaining and it's all being lost. I think I'll bring back some of these guests. So for the first time, I brought back somebody I found particularly entertaining. He talks about his wonderful career so vividly. I think you'll rather enjoy it. And so, without further ado, as I normally don't say, will you please say hello to the very wonderful Colin Vaines?
Hello.
Hurrah! Colin, you're, as I described you before, I think a hot shot producer, but you're also a Soho resident who campaigns against the redevelopment of this area of London. You're speaking from Soho right now. Now, it was known as London's dirty square mile, and only recently I saw again a quite terrible film called Emmanuel in Soho. And one of the characters in that quoted another Soho joke, which was it's the only place in the UK where it's shady on both sides of the street. Now, does this describe the Soho you're living in right now?
Sadly not. I would say that as someone who sort of grew up with I came up to Soho from the time I was about 14 or 15 in the 70s. Both my sister and I were obsessed about movies, and she got a job as a secretary at Paramount Studios on Wardour Street. They had their a little office there, and she worked very glamorously in the 16mm division. And I used to come up and see her, and was like blown away by what I thought of the life and the vivacity and all of the qualities that Soho had at the period. Although, needless to say, anyone who was around at that time would say to me, you should have been here in the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s. So we're just as I bore poor young people today saying you should have been in Soho in the 70s, that of course it's just a continuation of that. And Soho is very much, is it not, a state of mind? It's kind of more like our Soho, like you're doing our Bisto. So it's whatever it is, kids today that are around in these awful, fake, gentrified kind of places, they're still swinging off the chandeliers, having a great time and thinking they're in Soho. So it's kind of like, it is very much that. But sadly, I think the quality and the character, which partly came out of the kind of the slightly dodginess of the whole thing, is really becoming very much a thing of the past.
Well, we're certainly going to talk about Soho during the next 45 minutes. Colin, what else can we talk about? Can we talk about Madonna?
No, because I signed an NDA.
Can we talk about Harvey Weinstein?
We can, although, as I've said on many occasions, that I think there's a time and a place which is somewhere in the future when it's slightly less frenzied to talk about that, but we can certainly touch upon him. No, let me put that another way. Because
We know what you mean, Colin. We're going to come back to those subjects, but first of all, I want to know about the room in which you are sitting. So I'm looking at bookcases and my eye is drawn to a giant jar of Marmite. Can you explain that?
Well, I thought I'd put something up that, as people always seem to have something peculiar in the background. I looked around and thought, what is the most peculiar thing? It was actually sitting on the shelf. It is a jar of Marmite that is some sort of decorative thing to keep things in. But I absolutely love Marmite. That is unfortunately one of my fatal flaws in life, is a total addiction to it.
Have you had Marmite chocolate?
I have not. Have you?
Yes. It was for sale for a while at none other than Robert Dyer's. I mean, don't ask me why, but they
That's
had
really,
it. They had
that is very random.
random or what, but they had it on the counter as you were paying, and the woman said, "Do you want to try some Marmite chocolate?" I said, "Yes, of course I do." It was very nice, I have to say. Colin, we met a very long time ago. It was back in the 70s, and we were both working for what was called a trade paper, so a magazine that was mainly for people in the film business. We were crammed into one office, a lot of us, you, me, other people. I was reviewing films. I can't honestly remember what brought you to Screen International.
Well, I had a wonderful combination of being extremely knowledgeable and so inexpensive, in fact, I would say cheap, that the publisher of the paper couldn't believe it. When they were looking for a young reporter, I applied for the job, and I came clutching my cuttings from the training course I'd been on, and also some work I'd done on Time Out, because I'd managed to get my way in to do a couple of weeks' work there. Um, and Peter King, the late great Peter King, who published Screen International, was impressed by how much I knew and how little I wanted to do the job. I mean, it literally was on that level. I would have paid to do it probably, because it was such a big thing for me. And I was like 19 years old. So it was an amazing opportunity.
What attracted you? Was it the opportunity to swan around the world's film festivals?
Uh, do you know what? I really had this intention when I was 10 years old. I saw A Matter of Life and Death, which is still my favorite film ever, the Michael Powell film, Michael Powell and Pressburger. And I wanted to get into the film business. I mean, like at 10, I decided that was what I wanted to do. I didn't quite know what I wanted to do. And I thought maybe I wanted to aspire to what you were doing at the time, which was film criticism. But what happened was that I basically left school early when I was 17. I left school. I trained as a journalist when I was 18. And at 19, I started working on screen. I was very lucky that I got in and got this job. And my intention was to really to learn as much as I could about the business and to maybe become a film critic. That was a possibility at the time. But as time went on, it became apparent that what I really wanted to do was just get much more involved in the business proper. And it was a traditional sort of thing for people working in trade papers, whatever they were, that they tended to cross over into the business they were covering. Like a lot of music journalists went on to become producers or whatever. And so this was a kind of, it felt very natural after. I mean, I was there for 7 years and I met everybody I ever wanted to meet and I learned about the business. But I went from there into running development for what is now the BFI. It was called at the time the rather grand National Film Finance Corporation.
But before we get to that, who were you? Let's drop some names. Who were you meeting as you were traveling around the world?
Well, I met the fabulous people I met were like the really fabulous ones were people like Billy Wilder. When I went to festivals, like the first time I went to Cannes in '78, he was promoting Fedora. And funny enough, all of this has come back into my life because Jonathan Coe has just written this rather wonderful book, Mr. Wilder and Me, about about a young girl's experience as a translator working with Billy Wilder. I can't recommend this book more highly enough. It's a fabulous piece. But meeting people like that, I was obsessed. I was one of those people obsessed with the private life of Sherlock Holmes. I loved late Wilder. So I spent most of the time telling him how fantastic it was to his, I think, his considerable bemusement, but pleasure.
And was this the time, Cannes in the 1970s, when topless starlets were disporting themselves on the beach?
Yes, they were. There was a lot of that going on. There was a great deal of disporting or whatever going on. And it was the days of the great Edy Williams and all these legendary characters, the leopard ladies, the mother and daughter who dressed identically and paraded around the Croisette.
Tell,
Yes,
tell
it
us
was
about,
it was a lot.
for those who don't know, tell us about Edy Williams.
Edy Williams was a fabulous, how would you describe her? I was going to say starlet, but she was a bit more than that. She became sort of Russ Meyer's muse, didn't she, in some ways? And she was just a very voracious, powerful, another one of these extraordinary women who, when people are always talking about, people are exploited or whatever, my goodness me, rather like Britain's Pamela Green or whatever, these are women that knew what they were doing, what they were about, and went for it in a really impressive manner. So she was kind of one of those, God knows how these people would be today, because they were like early Instagram people. They were people creating their own image and going out and getting to Cannes and going on the beach and being topless and being surrounded by photographers. It's the kind of thing people do in selfies now, but at the time they were much more ambitious.
All gone now. Did you miss Cannes this year?
I didn't, well, did I miss it? I didn't go last year. I've been going almost consistently since 78. I mean, I missed a few of them. But I did not get over in 2019, so I can't pretend that I missed this year as well. I just find it's very odd. The whole thing of festivals is changing inevitably, and the world is changing, the way that we connect and so on. You can't emulate the thing of being in a place with other people and seeing films together, and just the sheer experience of bumping into people. For me, Cannes was a great opportunity once a year to see people from all around the world that I wouldn't otherwise see. So yes, I would miss it if it was gone altogether.
Next year, we hope. Now, you mentioned just in passing there that you were working for a finance organization. And you were also quite instrumental in beginning quite a few careers, weren't you?
Mm-hmm. Well, I've been very lucky in that, again, that when I worked at places like the NFFC, National Film Finance Corporation, that obviously a lot of people came through the door. I mean, I learned, one of the things was I learned from a great group of people that I used as my consultants, people like John Borman and Alan Parker and Richard Lester and so on. Incredible people came in as a part of the advisory board, and we were able to to help to finance, kind of scripts for newer people and newer talent as we went along. The biggest thing that I felt that I was able to do for new talent was later on was a thing called the Performing Arts Lab, which I ran for a few years, which kind of we selected people from the industry not to be taught screenwriting, but to develop and cultivate further. And that list of the people that I chose included people like Lee Hall, who went on to do Billy Elliot, and Simon Beaufoy, The Full Monty, and John Hodge, who did Trainspotting, and John Michael McDonough, who did The Guard, and Paul Laverty, who works constantly with Ken Lake. So I'm very proud. If I had one thing in my entire career that I would point to and say, I felt really good about this, it was the few years that I was doing that in England, and I did it down in South Africa as well.
Do they keep in touch? Do they say things like, "Thank you, Colin, I owe you everything"?
Funny enough, words I've never heard in my life. Very strange that, but it would be nice to kind of to think about that. Now, people, I mean, you have, people come and go, and so I have a number of very close friends that came out of that period of time. Just as on films, I have a number of very close friends. That somebody like Jared Harris has been a fantastic friend since I worked with him in the 90s on a poor benighted little film called Bee Monkey, which was a disaster, but which kind of introduced me to some wonderful people.
You've got a poster for it in your flat, haven't you?
I have. Do you want me to try and
Bee
turn this
Monkey.
around to give people a glimpse? As it was a very rare thing, as there were virtually the film didn't so much get released as Escape. Here we go. So there was the original poster from New York. It played it was in the cutting room for 3 years, and it started playing just at the time when I joined Miramax, and it was sort of gone within a week or so of that. So
Well, I'm not going to imply that no one's heard of that film, Colin, but nevertheless, let
Yes, it is one of the more obscure offerings on my resume. But what a cast! Asia Argento, Jared Harris, Jonathan Rhys-Meyers, Rupert Everett, who was making a comeback at the time. This is before My Best Friend's Wedding. And as I say, great friendships for life out of this film, which is often the way. And by the way, as we all know, as the old story goes, it's often the films that are disastrous in one way or another where you learn the most.
I hope we've intrigued everybody about Bee Monkey, and I bet it's out there somewhere. You can find it. But let's
You
move
could
on to some of the films whose titles we will know, because from 1999, you spent a lot of time working for a company called Miramax. Remind me who was in charge of that company?
It was Merrill Poster was my boss there.
Oh, okay, right.
Yes, but there was a gentleman called Harvey Weinstein, who at the time, of course, was at the top of the tree. That when that I joined the company just when they were winning Oscars by the bucket load for Shakespeare in Love, and I was offered the job of running development in New York, which I'd like to think was because of my brilliant and extraordinary skills, but I think had just as much to do with the fact that nobody else really wanted to do it because it was brutal, brutal. So everybody knew going in that that was what it was. You know, Harvey and his brother already had their reputation for being quite tricky to work with and tough to work with. But I'd done this film with him. I'd done Bee Monkey, and I'd seen kind of Harvey come and go or whatever. And I'd heard, you know, kind of there was a lot of noise all the time, a lot of shouting and screaming and whatever. His brother was rather quiet. His brother Bob, I got on with very well. That his brother was quieter, but you knew that when he went really quiet, you had to get out the way because then it was going to be really, really difficult.
I can't remember how many documentaries I've seen about Mr. Weinstein, but strangely, you don't appear in any of them. Why is that?
Because as I've always said, I will take my time. I will have at some point, I will say all the things that I want to say, which are extremely complicated and complex, as I think these situations always are extremely complicated and complex. I mean, I think it was somebody like Helena Bonham Carter the other day who was quoted as saying, you know, someone can be appalling in their behavior personally, but also be extremely good at what they do in their professional work. And that, I think, is the complication with Harvey, is that he was a bully and he was definitely doing stuff that he liked to keep away from everyone around him as much as he could do. But he was also, you know, sometimes he was misguided on films, and I saw things happen that I thought were just wrong, and other times I saw things turn around in ways that were really interesting, and that, you know, kind of that he played a fundamental role in the independent film sector at that time.
So is it fair to say, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Colin, that you felt you couldn't appear in these documentaries because it wouldn't be right to say things like, well, I got on with him, he did some good things.
I think that it's just a time when it's where you pick your words very carefully about what you say. Um, I think that I think that's the biggest thing. I felt like the documentaries all came out too soon and were a sort of pile on. I thought the first one was absolutely essential. And then I thought after that it felt like people were simply repeating a particular thing over and over again. Now, there could be argued that you can never say this enough. And I would accept that as well. But I felt like to get the real picture of a situation like that, you need to give it like 5 or 10 years or something, and then really get people together and talk about what happened. Nothing, absolutely not against the kind of the general sense that you have to condemn what happened, because it was appalling. I would say one of the worst things is that because we knew that he was screwing around all the time, the really sad thing is this assumption that it was completely consensual, because that's what people did in the film business, and it was not an uncommon thing. And it was not uncommon for both men and women to be involved in that scenario. So it was that the sadness is that it was bizarrely such a normal thing. We look back on this now. There's no question that you look back on, kind of what happened at that time in the Me Too movement. So you just kind of go, how could it have happened? But it was a general sense that everyone played their part in just allowing it to happen. And I think that's the tragedy of the whole thing, apart from the sickness of people involved.
You used the word brutal to describe your work pattern
Yes.
with Harvey. Can you elaborate on that? And also, if it was that bad, why did you stick it for as long as you did?
It was very bad, because he was an absolute bully. He would make Priti Patel look like a lovely little fairy walk in the park or whatever with her, I'm sure. No, he was a very bullying individual. But there was also, the truth is, you were working with incredible people. I went to join the company, and within, a few months of that, I was on Gangs of New York working with Martin Scorsese, one of my sort of great heroes. And I worked with Anthony Minghella on his things. I mean, I had this thing in the company where, to be absolutely honest, and I think that this was a large part of it, was that I was, apart from being quite articulate, and also I think being very good at what I was doing in terms of development, but also had a British accent. And I think that Harvey kind of liked the idea that somehow this gave a classy sheen to telling people what they had to do, that he was wanting them to do, and also acting as a kind of interpreter. He was no fool. As someone else in the company said, that he surrounded himself with people who were very good at their jobs and did them in a pleasant way. So that, but behind it all was this sort of raging, angry person who just wanted to kind of push everything to the limits to get what they wanted.
How many times did you say to yourself, that's it, I'm leaving?
Probably fewer than that. I would think probably like maybe 2 or 3 times. There was once on a plane trip I thought, I just can't do this anymore, and I kind of more or less said it. And of course at the end of it, he kind of like, because that was his whole modus operandi, was knock you down and build you up. He did it to everybody in the company, and that's a classic bullying sort of behavior, isn't it? So yes, it did happen, but not as frequently as you would think. And because at the end of the day, it was kind of like, it was, I mean, I was working 24/7, and it was an amazing opportunity.
You mentioned a film there, The Gangs of New York. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. But before then, we're going to take just the briefest of breaks, because we like to know what our hosts, Peccadillo Pictures, are up to. So have a look at this and then join us again in another couple of minutes.
I don't want to be a secret anymore. I want to be a partner.
Je t'ai vu tantôt, tu sais, regarder dans la piscine.
My mother always said I had a sting in my tail. Punched him in the arm, bruised my skin. My tender skin.
Alle zusammen, irgendwohin, an einen Ort, wo wir uns neue Geheimnisse lassen. He loves my show.
Toi et moi, on ira loin.
Perception's a funny thing, ain't it?
I needed to ask you something.
Why have you never come out to me?
It's like we're floating.
The hour of departure has arrived, and we go our ways.
Synchronized.
Can you see me?
I wanna see your face and feel your warm embrace all over again.
Thanks for joining us again. It's David McGillivray here, and my special guest on this edition of Little Did You Know, the Chat Show, is hotshot producer Colin Vaines. And this is where we talk about, it must have been the biggest film you worked on. I mean, I looked up the budget. Allegedly, it was $100 million. Near enough estimate?
Yeah, that is a near enough estimate. I mean, cheap compared with Marty's later films. I would say we got a bargain for that.
The last of the old school studio blockbusters, though, maybe shot at Cinecittà. What was it like being in charge of that kind of budget? Did you have sleepless nights?
Do you know what? It was because everyone had committed to this thing. I mean, the budget did go up, obviously, because we were it's just that Marty's films always go over, and there's no question of that. But I never felt that. I was just concerned about getting it right creatively. And it was a project I cared deeply about. I was brought onto it almost as soon as I arrived. I read all that Marty had been trying to develop it since 1970. He'd read the book. 1977, he announced it in Variety as Gangs of New York, directed by Martin Scorsese, music by The Clash. So that was how it started. It was a difficult film because we went in, even after all that time, the script wasn't fully there. And there'd been various versions, one by Jay Cox, one by Steve Zalian, one by, who at the time was working out. I brought Hussein Amini in, and eventually I brought Kenny Lonergan on. But it was constantly being rewritten and redrafted or whatever as we went. So it was a tough shoot. So my biggest concern was of course, it was always financial. What was the impact going to be if you make any changes? But much more than that, it was the creative side.
Did it make its money back?
I think it did eventually. It had a very rough opening where it was kind of like, again, nobody quite knew what to make of it. And I think a lot of people were expecting this very mean street style, down and dirty film. And of course, what Scorsese had in his head was a cross between The Wild Bunch and Once Upon a Time in America. So the minute that people saw footage and went, holy cow, what is this thing? That I think that caused some concerns or whatever. And again, it was like it had a very soft opening, but it improved dramatically over time. And obviously it picked up awards nominations and so on. And these are the days when the DVD release of a film would make a huge difference and you would recoup massively from that. So yes, the short answer is it would have made its money back.
Was it a huge buzz working on a film with that kind of budget, or do you prefer something more small scale?
Oh, I actually do prefer small scale because I think there's an awful lot of waste on a film at that level. I mean, I thought it was, it was incredible to be on. And also, as you said, it's the last of a particular old school way of making films that we built that set at Cinecittà. It was 1/4 of a square mile and it was incredible. It had the docks and it had all the 5-point streets and so on. And it weathered over the months that we shot in. So it was an incredible experience to be in that sort of like an old-fashioned, old-school thing. Apart from the thrill for me as this little nerdy boy from Croydon, going to Cinecittà and going to the plaster shop, and there's one of the figures from Ben-Hur sitting outside. You kind of go, this is just incredible. Plus, and you'll enjoy this, David, the fact that because Scorsese is as much of a nerd as I am, in fact, much more of a nerd than I am in terms of what he's seen and done, his insistence on casting people like Barbara Boucher as one of the sort of the upper crust of New York, that this was fabulous. David Hemmings was my favorite that turned up on the set that was in there. And he had a wonderful line that he used to, I'm sure he quoted it many, many times. He'd say, people used to think I was dead, but I was in Hollywood directing the A-Team. But he was just coming off Gladiator and he's sort of come back in that. So it was fantastic in terms of old school cult actors. And then, of course, these fantastic people like Stephen Graham. It was the first time I'd worked with him. And that Scorsese's casting director, Ellen Lewis, had cast him for because she was just a fan of British films. And Scorsese had this thing, as you might have seen in Age of Innocence, which is people at that period would likely have traces of a British or Irish accent still much more strongly than they would do now.
Let's move on to a film which didn't have quite the budget of Gangs of New York, and this must have been a particularly difficult project to set up. That's my guess, anyway. It's Coriolanus. Now, I know why it happened, and it starred an actor who was in, I think, your first film.
Absolutely, yeah. Ralph Fiennes, that I got him out the RSC. The very first film I did was when I was working with David Putnam, and I developed this story for him about T. Lawrence at the Paris Peace Conference. It was like a little microcosm of what happened with Lawrence and Prince Faisal at the Peace Conference. And Rafe was a friend ever after. He's still a friend to this day. And when he was doing Coriolanus, he was obsessed about making this. It's the first time it had been done as a feature film. But of course, needless to say, at like a $15 million budget, which I think it was at one point, and one of the more obscure Shakespeare's, I think would be fair to say, that he wasn't exactly awash with offers, and he wanted to make it as his directing debut. So essentially, there were two other producers who were wonderful, Gabby Tanner and Julia Taylor-Stanley involved, but it just needed somebody to take it over the line, and that was essentially what happened. Was that I got involved and we worked together. Gabby put it together with money, which she brought money in from Serbia, where we could shoot and get incredible production value. Julia did incredible work pulling together sort of tax deals and those kind of, and soft money and so on. And between us, we got it over the line between a mixture of like the BBC and Lionsgate and some independent finance. So, but it was a tough, very tough film to make, but I'm very proud of it. I think that he did an incredible job as first-time director and star.
I think it's one of my favourite Shakespeare films. I'm not buttering you up. I happen to like Shakespeare films that are updated, as with, the
Right.
Ian McKellen, Richard III. I think you did the same sort of thing there, and it worked.
Thank you. That's very kind of you to say. I'm very proud of it. I think Rafe did an incredible job. John Logan and he adapted the play and did a brilliant adaptation, I think. But it does feel like a film, like all Shakespeare does. It feels like you can update it because what they're dealing with thematically is today. I mean, and also this insights into human nature. We'd say on the set every day, kind of go. I talked to Joan Washington, who was doing the verse speaking with the cast. We just say, how did Shakespeare, whatever you believe, whether it's real, it is Shakespeare, whether you think it's the Earl of Oxford or whatever, whoever it was, and I believe it is one person, how did they have this insight into the human condition? It's incredible.
We're going to talk about conspiracy theories later. Colin, you brought the subject up. Okay, Madonna. Now, what's she like?
She's fabulous. I actually do think she's fabulous. She's an extraordinary person, just an extraordinary person, like self-belief like you've never believed. Nothing I could tell you would say anything other than what people imagine that she is. And so in terms of like my involvement on the film that I did with her, that I was in the middle of Coriolanus, and CAA said, "Would you like to get involved with this project as well?"
Sorry, let's just say it's called WE.
WE, yes, WE, and it was a passion project of hers about a mixture, combining the stories of Wallis Simpson and King Edward VIII and a present day story of a girl who's trying to investigate what she felt happened or didn't happen. Anyway, all I did sign an NDA, so I'm not actually permitted to talk in any detail at all about the thing. But it's a funny film in as much as I put together, I think, a fantastic crew on it, including a brilliant cinematographer, Hagen Bogdansky, who'd done The Lives of Others, and he'd done Young Victoria when I was for me a few years earlier. And I think he made it look absolutely glorious. And I think that she's got a great eye, actually. And the film is a funny film in that people wanted to kill it before it came out just because of who it is and who was connected to it. It's one of the stranger films in my career, in as much as it's one that sort of pops up occasionally. People suddenly kind of talk about it and are very enthusiastic. So I don't know. I have to tell you, I haven't seen it.
Why?
Well, I saw all the dailies or whatever, but because we kind of, by the end of the film, it was differences of opinions. Let's put it like that. So I have not actually seen the finished film. I have seen bits of it, of course, in passing. I remember seeing some of it once on an airplane, and somebody was watching it next to me. But it's not actually a film I have seen myself. I call it part of my direct to shrink wrap collection, which just gets put to one side, and I look at the covers and think, well, that's quite nice, and I see, make sure my name's on the box and so on, and that's it.
So that's all we're going to get out of you on the subject of Madonna and WE. So let's move on to Soho, safer ground. Now, I enjoy putting people together, and this is what happened. I interviewed on the aforementioned Likey series a man called Dominic DeLargy. Great name, and he has a podcast called Soho Bites, which I commend to you. And after our chat, I thought, I know who you ought to meet. Colin Vaines. So, well, virtually anyway, you have met him now, haven't you? What happened?
We met more than virtually. We socially distanced in the Soho Whiskey Club and did a chat about Peeping Tom, which of course is feeds into my obsession about Michael Powell that started when I saw A Matter of Life and Death and continued with when I finally met him, which was in Cannes at the King of Comedy party. He was standing in a corner wearing a three-piece tweed suit in like 80 degrees. And I saw this chap and I thought, that looks like Michael Powell. And that's kind of, but anyway, I went over and found out it was. And having met him once before, very briefly, when he came into the offices of Screen International, but was considered a prime bore at the time by my colleagues because he was trying to make sort of low budget sex films and had some other stuff going on, and he was really not in a good place in his career. Anyway, he was years later in Cannes, and I was able to tell him how amazing and brilliant I thought he was. So we talked about Peeping Tom, which is a Soho film.
It's a film. It's not actually shot in Soho. It's over the other side of Oxford Street, which is officially not Soho. However, we'll gloss over that. But you had a chat about Peeping Tom on Soho Bites.
Yes, absolutely.
It's extremely interesting. If you're interested in Soho and the notorious shocker Peeping Tom, I would say not now, wait till the end of this show, but the podcast is called Soho Bites, and Colin is absolutely fascinating about Peeping Tom and his idol Michael Powell. Colin, Soho is ever changing, but we've lost a lot of it recently. What buildings do you miss most?
It's. I mean, there's so many that have gone that it would be. I don't think that I can't say that I can define exactly which ones, but from the time that they took down the old police station and started developing around there on Broadwick Street, that time forwards, we've lost so many of them, and we're struggling at the moment to retain 20th Century House, which of course has a great history because it was built in 1937 and 20th Century and Fox had just merged, and they leased it, and it's been until the time of the Disney takeover last year. It's been the center point for 20th Century Fox, and films like Alien have been set up out there. It's not necessarily the most remarkable piece of architecture. It's a very standard piece of 30th architecture, beautiful, really beautifully done, and it stands in harmony with the other buildings in Soho Square. But of course, there's this relentless desire to monetize the investment. So the landlords want to knock it down and put up. They were going to put up a Singapore-style, airport-style building. Now they're talking about doing a horrible Frankenstein monster mix of facade and new building.
It can't be said too often that the building has to be preserved because it's symbolic of old Soho, which was the heart of the British film industry. No longer, but when both Colin and I were growing up, practically every company had their offices in Soho, and Fox is the last of them.
Mhm. It is. It's absolutely true. I mean, and Soho, kind of was adopted very early on. This guy, Charles Urban, an early colour pioneer, he started in 1904. This still Urban House is still there as a memory of that. So the history is really long and distinguished, and it's really a sad thing. But I don't know whether the answer is to keep some sort of half-assed facade of it. I don't. That to me feels like. I mean, that's the argument, is that at least you've got an essence of it, but it's not going to be what was built there.
Happy Memories got 2 preview theatres in there, and they're both beautiful. Art Deco.
I've already taken those out.
They're gone.
Yes, they demolished that. They've taken everything out. No, it's really sad.
Oh no, I didn't know.
Yeah.
What's Soho been like in lockdown?
Fabulous. I mean, it's like a tragedy, 75,000 dead or whatever, total mismanagement by this government. But I got to say, in terms of a personal experience, being able to be in Soho, smell the grass when it's cut in the churchyard, hear the birds, not be falling over tourists with wheelie trolleys, not fall over, not be accosted by the drunks and the winos every 30 seconds, all of which is kind of like, we accept that's all part of life in Soho, not have the crazy kids screaming at 4 a.m. It's just been rather fabulous, and also made me look at Soho. I looked at the buildings and so on in here, looked at that mixture of things from the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s. It's kind of an incredible mixture of things, and I loved having that time and space to kind of be part of that.
You must have been aware of a film that was shot in Soho last year. We're still waiting for it. Who knows when it'll open, but it's called Last Night in Soho. Did you have a look over people's shoulders when it was being shot?
Well, Edgar's a friend, so I kind of would bump into him around and about Soho. So they filmed
Edgar Wright.
Edgar Wright, sorry, yes, Edgar Wright, the director. Sorry, that was awful. That was total sort of like ugh. Anyway. But Edgar Wright, the director, is a good friend, and so I would bump into him on the street, generally just to kind of to say to him, open get on with it and get out of the way, because there's nothing worse than film people trying to address someone who's another film person and say, oh, sorry, sir, no, you can't cross the road here, you can't do that. Or they come down my street and say, can you leave the doors open? It'll look better on film, and so on. I go, yeah, how much are you going to pay me for it?
We're looking forward to it enormously, as we are to a film you're going to make, which does have a strong Soho plot line, and that is a film about the singer Marianne Faithfull. Can you tell us what her Soho connection is?
Well, her Soho connection is that tragically, when she was really at her lowest ebb, and addicted to drugs and so on, she lived on a wall on St. Anne's Court, which had not been redeveloped at the time. It was bombed out from the war. For 2 years or so, she effectively lived on a wall and got her clothes cleaned at the sort of like the local laundromat, and got food occasionally. Every now and again, Francis Bacon would see her and kind of say, come and have a meal at Wheeler's or whatever. But yes, she had a big Soho connection during that period.
What stage is this production at?
It's like everything else, knocked for six slightly by COVID. So we kind of had to slow everything down. But we have Lucy Boynton attached, who I worked with first time as a little girl in Miss Potter. She played young Renée Zellweger in that. And here she is now as Mary in Bohemian Rhapsody and in The Politician on Netflix. So she's playing Marianne. So we have wonderful actress attached. We have, I think, rather a good script. And we're just looking at kind of pulling things together for next year.
When everything gets back to normal, we're going to see that film. And then are we going to see a whole wodge of films about COVID? Or is it something that you think people will not want to remember? What's your prediction?
I really hope. I don't know about I think it's something that happened, but I don't think that films about it would be of any interest to anybody at all at the moment. It's something that it can be dealt with in the background of something. It's the same with this whole issue of Brexit and so on. I'm working on a television series idea, which is kind of set slightly forward in time, but we have to judge how much we want to kind of go on about that stuff and how much you just want to present a world that's moved on and in whatever version you want to take a view on, but I would say is probably a more difficult world to be in. So I think that with the COVID stuff, that let's look back at Contagion and films that were made 10 or 15 years ago about it, and let's move on from it. And if it's there, it's just a colour in the background of things.
I'm inclined to agree, Colin, but alas, time is up. It's been an absolute delight. Thank you very much for joining me again.
No, it was an absolute pleasure, David. I think that this is a wonderful idea for the show, and I think it's great to revisit some of the people that you spoke to, because as you said, it's like it felt, even when I was doing it before, it felt strange that this thing is just out there in the ether and gone. And I don't know whether the K-pop fans that seem to be watching were necessarily the people who would be most interested in this stuff.
I was a bit suspicious because of the kind of questions they were asking us while we were going out live. They didn't seem that interested in what we were talking about, but they did want to know how old I was and if I had an Instagram account. So now we have a much more appropriate audience, I'm delighted to say, and I hope you enjoyed this edition of the show with the very wonderful Colin Vaines. I'll be back again next week. Oh, now I think of it though, I'll be on Patreon right now, and if subscribers would like to go there, they'll find an extra 15 minutes of material. There we are, that's the plug. So join me there perhaps, but definitely see you next week at the same time with another guest. Until then, this is David McGillivray saying thank you very much for joining us. Bye.